For those who have ever looked danger straight in the eye and offered it something warm. In Sicily, the dead are never truly buried, and neither are the living. The sun had not yet finished climbing when Giulia Ferraro opened her bakery. That was how she had always done it, before the light was full, before Palermo fully woke, before the noise of the Via dei Calderai returned to its ordinary chaos of scooters and vegetable vendors and old men arguing over football from their plastic chairs. She opened the heavy wooden door at 4:45 every morning, stepped over the threshold into the warm, dark interior, and began. The bakery was called Il Forno di Rosa, Rosa's oven, after her grandmother, who had opened it 53 years ago on this same narrow street in the Ballarò quarter of Palermo. The sign above the door was original, the paint flaking at the corners, the cursive letters in sun-faded gold. Giulia had been offered money to repaint it twice. She had declined both times. Some things were not supposed to look new. Inside, the bakery was modest and immaculate. Glass cases along one wall held pastries, cannoli with ricotta filling, sfincione dotted with anchovies, iris fritte dusted in powdered sugar. Wooden shelves ran the length of the back wall, waiting for the loaves. The counter was pale marble, worn smooth in the centre from decades of flour-dusted hands. There was a small iron table near the window with 2 chairs, not for lingering, Giulia always said, because this was a bakery, not a cafe. And yet somehow people always lingered. She was 28 years old and had been working in this bakery since she was 7. Her parents had moved to Milan when she was 16, and she had stayed. Not from stubbornness, though she was stubborn. Not from obligation, though she felt it. She stayed because the bakery smelled like her grandmother, and her grandmother was the only person who had ever made Giulia feel entirely, unambiguously safe. Rosa had died 3 years ago. Giulia had inherited the bakery, the apartment above it, 12,000 euros in savings, and an inexplicable sense that she was being watched over. She worked in silence those first hours. The dough had been prepared the night before, naturally leavened, 22 hours of slow fermentation, and now it waited in cloth-lined baskets in the cool back room. She loaded the stone oven carefully, one loaf at a time. The first heat of the day settled over her like a conversation between old friends. By 6:30, the first loaves were out. By 7, the regulars began to arrive. Old Signora Cattaneo for her rosemary focaccia, the brothers from the hardware shop for their sesame rolls, the young mother from across the street, always exhausted, always grateful, for the soft milk bread her daughter refused to eat anywhere else. Giulia knew their orders before they spoke them. She had learned from her grandmother that a bakery was a form of memory. Every order was a relationship, every loaf a kind of promise. It was on an ordinary Tuesday in October that he first came. She noticed him before the door opened, because the bakery fell silent in a particular way, not simply quiet, but held, the way a room holds its breath. Then the door opened, and he stepped in, and she understood why. He was tall. That was the first thing, tall and unhurried, in the way of men who have never needed to rush, because everything waits for them. He wore a dark coat, despite the relative warmth of the Sicilian autumn. Wool, well cut, the collar turned up slightly against a wind that had already died. His hair was dark, thick, combed back from a face that was severe and still, the face of a man who had learned long ago not to show what he was thinking. He might have been 35, might have been 40. It was difficult to say.
There was an agelessness to him that came not from youth, but from authority, as though he had been born already knowing exactly who he was. He stood in the doorway for one moment and looked at the bakery. Not the display cases, not the shelves. He looked at the room itself, cataloguing exits and sightlines with the automatic efficiency of a man accustomed to assessing spaces not for beauty, but for risk. Then his eyes moved to Giulia. She was behind the counter, floury to the elbows, a smear of something across her left cheek that she was not aware of. She was not, by any calculation, impressive at that moment. And yet, she did not look away from him. She held his gaze with a steadiness that surprised even herself. The other customers, 3 of them, had gone very quiet. He approached the counter. "Pane," he said. Just the one word, bread. "Which kind?" Giulia asked. Something moved across his face, very briefly, as though the question itself were unusual. "The loaf," he said. "Plain, the large one." She wrapped it for him in the brown paper and string she used for everything, her grandmother's practice, which felt to her both old-fashioned and correct. She placed it on the counter. He reached into his coat and produced cash. Not a wallet retrieved from a pocket, but folded notes that appeared between 2 fingers as though from nowhere. He set them on the marble without counting them. It was more than the bread cost, significantly more. "You've given me too much," Giulia said. He looked at her again. That look, flat and absolute and slightly startled, as though she were an equation that was not resolving correctly. "Keep it," he said. "I'd rather give you your change." A pause. Then, from him, the faint suggestion of something that was not quite a smile. Not warm, more like the acknowledgement of an unexpected obstacle. He took the change. He took the bread. He left. The bakery exhaled. Signora Cataneo, who was 73 and had lived in the Bellaro all her life, leaned across the counter and lowered her voice. "Do you know who that is?" she whispered. "No," Giulia said, already returning to the oven. Signora Cataneo watched her for a moment. Then she pressed her lips together and said nothing more, which, Giulia had learned, meant more than whatever words she'd decided not to speak. He came back the next morning. Same time, same coat, same loaf. And the morning after that, and the one after that. By the 5th morning, Giulia had begun to set one aside for him, the largest plain loaf, the one that came out of the centre rack where the heat was most even, where the crust developed that particular deep amber she was proud of. She told herself this was simply good business practice. She told herself this was what her grandmother would have done. She did not tell herself the other thing, which was that she had begun listening for the specific quality of silence that preceded his arrival. On the 6th morning, when she placed the wrapped loaf on the counter and he set down his cash, she said, "Would you like some jam today?" He stopped. It was as complete and total a stop as she had ever witnessed in a human being, as though every system in him simply paused, processing. "Jam," he repeated. "We have 3 kinds this week: fig, bergamot, and a blood orange that my neighbour makes." She kept her voice conversational, professional. "The bergamot goes well with the plain loaf if you're having it with coffee." He looked at her for what felt like a full 10 seconds. "Bergamot," he said. She reached below the counter and produced a small jar, wrapped it in the same paper and string as the bread. She added it to the parcel. He paid. He left. But that morning at the door he paused, and without turning around he said, quiet enough that she almost missed it,
My name is Enzo. Then he was gone. It would be 3 weeks before she learned his last name. 3 weeks before she understood that the silence that fell when he entered a room was not admiration. It was fear. His name was Enzo Carbone. She found out from Matteo, the boy who delivered her flour every Thursday morning, 17 years old, talkative in the way of people who have not yet learned that some information is dangerous to carry. "The man who comes every morning," Giulia said, refilling Matteo's coffee, because she had learned that Matteo talked more freely when he had something warm in his hands. Tall, dark coat. Matteo had gone very still in the particular way of young men who know something they are deciding whether to tell. "You should not ask about him, Signora Ferraro," he said finally. "I'm not asking anything. I already know his first name." Matteo looked at her, then at the door, then back at her. He took a long sip of coffee. "Carbone," he said. "Enzo Carbone." The name meant nothing to her, which she said. Matteo set down his cup with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing their next words very precisely. He manages certain things in the neighborhood and beyond." "What kind of things?" "The kind that make people not ask questions." Giulia considered this. Outside, a pigeon walked along the windowsill with the self-important air of a bird that had never been threatened. "Is he dangerous?" she asked. Matteo picked up his empty flour sacks. "Signora Ferraro," he said gently, "everyone in this neighborhood knows who Enzo Carbone is. And everyone in this neighborhood does not look at him. They don't speak to him unless spoken to. He paused. They certainly do not offer him jam." Giulia said nothing. Matteo left, shaking his head. She thought about it for the rest of the day, between customers, between loaves. She thought about the way Enzo Carbone moved through her bakery, not like a man who expected fear, but like a man for whom fear was simply ambient, a background condition he had stopped noticing the way anyone stops noticing the hum of a refrigerator. She thought about the way he looked at her, that flat, assessing look that had in it something she could not name, something that was not aggression or desire or cruelty, but was something more complicated and more careful than any of those. She thought about the fact that he said his name. She had asked him nothing. She had simply offered jam, and he had said his name, and she had the distinct impression that neither of those things was something he did often. The next morning, she set out the bergamot jam before he arrived. He noticed it immediately when he reached the counter, that preemptive placement, the small jar already waiting beside the wrapped loaf. Something in his jaw shifted. Not a smile, precisely, a loosening. "You remembered," he said. "I remember everyone's order," Giulia said. This was true. It was also not entirely the point, and they both seemed to know it. He paid. He picked up the bread and the jam. At the door he paused again. She was beginning to recognize this as a habit of his, this doorway pause, as though he used the threshold as a moment to decide something. "How long have you had this bakery?" he asked. His voice was low and even, accustomed to being heard without raising. "My grandmother had it for 50 years. I've had it for 3. "You kept her name on the sign." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "She earned it." Another of those pauses. Then he walked out, and Giulia went back to work. And she noticed that her hands were entirely steady, which felt like a small victory she couldn't quite explain. Over the following 2 weeks, the neighbourhood adjusted its understanding of the situation. Word travelled the way word always travels in the Bolaro, quickly, quietly, with the particular velocity of information that people simultaneously want to discuss and are afraid to. Old Signora Cattaneo told her daughter-in-law, who told the pharmacist, who told the brothers at the hardware shop. What they were passing between them, wrapped in euphemism and omission, was essentially this. The Carbone man comes to Ferraro's bakery every morning, and the Ferraro girl looks at him like he's just a man, and nobody knows what to make of it. What they did not pass on, because some information is too heavy even for gossip, was the fuller context of who Enzo Carbone was. That required knowing the Carbone family, which in Palermo meant knowing a great deal of uncomfortable history. The Carbones had been part of the fabric of the Bolaro for 4 generations. Not openly, not declaratively, they did not wave flags or make announcements. They existed in the city the way certain old buildings exist, foundational, load-bearing, present in the structure of everything around them, even when invisible. The family had interests in construction, in shipping, in several restaurants on the waterfront, and in a number of other enterprises that did not appear in any city registry. Enzo was the eldest son. He had been educated in Milan and for 2 years in the United States, Boston specifically, where there were certain family connections that dated back to the mid-20th century and the original crossing of Sicilian families into American organized crime. He had returned to Palermo 8 years ago, after his father's illness, and had assumed management of everything with the efficiency and lack of ceremony of a man for whom succession had been not a question, but a mathematical certainty. He was not beloved, he was not hated, he was respected in the way that powerful natural forces are respected. Tornadoes, tides, winter storms. You did not challenge these things, you prepared for them, you moved around them carefully. No one, as far as anyone in the Bolaro could remember, had ever offered Enzo Carbone jam. Giulia, for her part, knew only Matteo's abbreviated version of this. She knew the word dangerous, and she knew the word manages, which she understood was doing a great deal of work. She knew that the neighbourhood moved differently when he was in it. And she knew with a certainty she could not have explained to anyone's satisfaction that the man who came into her bakery every morning and stood at her counter and gave her the change back when she insisted, and occasionally paused at the threshold to ask her a single, careful question, was, in some way she could not yet name, lonely. Not the loneliness of isolation, the loneliness of altitude. The loneliness of a man surrounded by people who cannot look him in the eye. She went on offering him jam. She went on looking him in the eye. Whatever was coming, she thought, would come regardless. October deepened into November, and the mornings became cool, and the light over Palermo took on that particular quality of southern Italian autumn, bright and slightly mournful, like something trying very hard to stay cheerful about the dark that was coming. Giulia wrapped herself in her grandmother's apron, which was so large it went around her twice, and she baked, and she waited, though she would not have called it waiting. Enzo Carbone came every morning. They developed, without discussing it, without acknowledging it in any way, a routine within a routine. He arrived at 7:15, always. The loaf was always waiting. The jam, she now kept a small rotation of flavours, always telling him what was new, as though she were presenting options to any customer, was always on the counter. Their conversations were brief. They were also, somehow, the most substantial conversations Giulia had in any given day. She asked him one morning in early November whether he took his coffee at home or somewhere else. "Somewhere else," he said. "There's a place on the corner of Via Maqueda that does good espresso," she said, "but it's been under different management for 6 months, and I think the machine needs calibrating." He looked at her. "You've been monitoring the espresso quality on Via Maqueda?" "I pay attention to things," she said simply. There was something in his expression that she had begun to be able to read, a very slight brightening that was not quite warmth, but was the country warmth was in. "So do I," he said. "I know," said Giulia, and because she was constitutionally unable to be indirect, "you assess every room you walk into, you count exits, you notice where everyone is standing." A silence. Then, "How do you know that?" "Because you did it the first morning you came in. 3 customers, 2 exits. You clocked both. And the backroom door that was ajar. You noted it all in about 4 seconds. He was very still. "Most people don't notice me noticing," he said. "I told you. I pay attention." He picked up his bread and his jam, and he stood there for a moment longer than usual, as though the threshold calculation was taking more time. "My name is Enzo Carbone," he said, as though he were offering it again, more fully this time, knowing she knew it now, as though the naming were a deliberate thing. "I know," she said. "I'm Giulia." "I know," he said, and left. She stood at the counter with flour on her hands and understood that something had shifted, though she could not have said precisely what. The man who came with Enzo, because there was always, Giulia had noticed, a man, waited outside. Always outside. He was broad-shouldered and quiet, and stood near the door in a way that would have looked casual if you didn't notice the way his eyes never stopped moving. His name, she eventually learned from Matteo, was Salvatore. He had been with Enzo since they were teenagers. He was not a friend, exactly. The word friend implied a certain equality, but he was the closest thing to one that Giulia could identify in the orbit of Enzo Carbone. One morning, after Enzo had left, Giulia stepped out with an extra sesame roll in a paper bag and held it out to Salvatore. He stared at it. "You've been standing out here every morning for a month," she said. "Take it." He looked at the roll. He looked at the door Enzo had just disappeared through. He looked back at the roll. "He doesn't need to know," Giulia said. Salvatore took the roll. He said nothing. But the next morning, and every morning after that, he gave her a very small nod when she appeared at the door, a nod that was, she thought, the closest this particular man came to saying thank you and good morning, and possibly, "I'm glad someone is paying attention." The neighborhood watched all of this with the collective held breath of people watching a tightrope walk. There was no malice in it. Most of them, especially the older ones, had a complicated affection for Giulia, who had been born among them and stayed among them and made excellent bread. They were afraid for her, which is different from being afraid of her. The Hardware brothers, Marco and Dino, 50s, mustachioed, constitutionally anxious, took to arriving at the bakery slightly early on mornings when they had seen Carbone's car on the street. Not to intervene, they would not have intervened, but to witness, which they felt was at least something. Old Signora Cattaneo, who was more pragmatic about such matters, stopped by one afternoon when the bakery was empty and asked Giulia directly, "Are you careful?" "I'm always careful," Giulia said. "With bread, yes. With men, I am asking." Giulia was quiet for a moment, scoring the top of an unbaked loaf with a lame, the long, thin blade she used to control the rise. She made 4 precise cuts. "He hasn't done anything wrong," she said finally. "Of course not. He never does anything himself." Giulia set down the lame. "What would you have me do? Refuse to sell him bread?" Signora Cataneo was quiet. Then, "No. I would have you understand what you're doing. There is a difference between not knowing and knowing." Giulia looked at her for a long moment. "Then I'm choosing to know," she said. Signora Cataneo nodded, slowly, with the look of a woman who has seen enough of life to understand that this is sometimes how it goes, not through ignorance, but through willful clarity. She bought her focaccia and left. That evening, closing up the bakery, Giulia stood at the window and looked at the street below, where the last vendors were folding up their stalls. She was thinking about altitude, about loneliness, about a man who said his own name like he was offering something he rarely offered. She was thinking about what her grandmother had always said. The bread doesn't ask who's eating it, but the baker decides who to bake for. She put on the lights, locked the door, and went upstairs. It was the 3rd week of November when Enzo first sat down. Not at the small iron table. That would have been too deliberate, too obvious, too much like a choice that could be questioned. He sat on the edge of the counter, which was somehow even more intimate, being utterly unself-conscious, and he watched her work while she was in the middle of shaping a batch of ciabatta. She registered his sitting down the way she registered most things. She noticed it, filed it, and kept moving. She had learned that Enzo Carbone responded better to ease than to acknowledgement. He was not a man who needed things made explicit. "You do that the same way every time," he said after a while. "Muscle memory," she said. "Same as most things, after enough repetition." "What happens if you vary it?" "The bread tells you. It has a feel to it at the right stage. If the shaping's wrong, the crumb comes out uneven." She held up a shaped loaf for a moment. "You feel the tension in the surface. It should be taut, but not tight, like a—" She paused, looking for the analogy. "Like a decision," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her hands, and there was something in his focus that was not casual, the concentrated attention of a man who pays close attention to everything, but who was paying a different quality of attention to this. "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother used to make bread." It was said simply, factually, with no obvious bid for sympathy. But in the landscape of what Giulia had come to know about Enzo Carbone, which was mostly what was absent from his expressions, what was not said in his phrasing, it was the most personal thing he had offered. "What kind?" she asked. She kept shaping. She did not look at him directly, giving him the conversational equivalent of a side door. "Something simple. No name. Flour, water, salt. Very dense." A pause. "She made it on Sunday mornings. I don't think she baked any other time." "Sunday bread is different," Giulia said. "There's no hurry in it." He considered this. "She died when I was 15. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." "That doesn't always make it smaller." He looked at her then, that full, flat look, and in it was something she hadn't seen before, not vulnerability exactly, more like recognition. The look of a man who has been told a true thing and is deciding what to do with it. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." They were quiet for a while. Giulia slid the loaves into cloth baskets, covered them, left them for the final rise. She washed her hands. She made coffee, the small mocha pot she kept on the back burner, the same one her grandmother had used, and without asking she poured 2 cups and set one on the counter beside where Enzo sat. He looked at the cup. "Under different circumstances," he said, in a tone she couldn't quite read. "What circumstances? If I were a different kind of man." He picked up the cup, drank, set it down. His hands, she noticed, were large and careful. The hands of someone who understood that force was a tool that needed precision. This wouldn't be appropriate. What wouldn't be? Any of this. She looked at him over the rim of her own cup. The bread? The coffee? He stopped. Something moved across his face. The conversation. "Conversations are generally considered appropriate," Giulia said. "Not these ones." He stood from the counter, set down the cup. He stood very close to the edge of the small space, and she was suddenly aware of his height in a way that was not alarming, but was present, physical. The way a person becomes aware of a fire, not because it burns, but because of its warmth at a distance. "Why not?" she asked. Her voice was steady. He looked down at her. She was not small, but he was genuinely tall, and his expression was something she was not sure she had a name for yet. "Because you don't know what I am," he said, "and I don't want you to know." "That's not true," she said. A pause. "Which part?" "Either. I have a reasonable idea of what you are, and you—" She held his gaze. "You came back every morning. You could have sent someone. You could have stopped coming. You haven't." The silence between them had a different texture now, not uncomfortable, more like the moment before rain, when the air has changed and everyone can feel it, but the drops haven't come yet. Enzo picked up his coat from where he'd set it on the counter. He put it on, that practiced, unhurried movement, and for a moment he just stood there. "Same time tomorrow," he said. "I'll have the bread ready," said Giulia. He left. Salvatore, outside, gave her the small nod. She watched them walk down the narrow street, Enzo unhurried and tall, Salvatore half a step behind, and the morning closed around them like water around a stone. She went back inside and stood for a moment in the warm, flower-scented quiet of the bakery. Under different circumstances, she thought. She was beginning to wonder about those circumstances. The first time Giulia saw Enzo in the night was an accident. She was coming home from her friend Elena's apartment. Elena lived 20 minutes by foot across the Balaro, and Giulia preferred to walk, even in the dark, because she had grown up on these streets and knew them the way she knew her own hands. When she turned a corner and found herself on the edge of something, a narrow alley lit by a single lamp, 3 men. The configuration of the scene, 2 standing, one against the wall, a particular quality of stillness that was not ordinary stillness, arranged itself in her understanding before she could process the individual details. And then she processed the individual detail that was Enzo Carbone standing at the centre of it. He had not seen her yet. He was speaking to the man against the wall, quietly, she could not hear the words, and the man was nodding in the rapid, small way of someone whose agreement is entirely motivated by fear. The 2 standing men were very still, in the way that Salvatore was still outside her bakery, professionally still, alert, watching everything except what their boss was doing, which they did not need to watch, because their job was to watch everything else. Giulia stood at the corner for approximately 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked back the way she had come, adding 10 minutes to her route. She thought about it all the way home. Not with fear, or not primarily with fear, but with the particular clarity of someone whose understanding has just been updated. She had known, in the abstract way you know a fact read in a book, that Enzo Carbone was dangerous. Seeing it was different from knowing it. Seeing it gave it texture. He was not cruel in what she'd seen, no raised voice, no violence, but he was absolute in a way that no amount of morning conversation had fully conveyed. He was a man to whom other men gave their agreement not because they chose to, but because the alternative was something they did not want to contemplate. She went to bed, and she lay in the dark above the bakery for a long time. She woke at 4:30, as she always did. She made the dough, she baked the bread. And when Enzo came at 7:15, she put the loaf on the counter, and she looked at him, and she said nothing about the alley. He looked at her with slightly narrowed eyes. Reading her, she understood, looking for something. "You walked home late last night," he said. She went still. "You saw me. I was informed." A pause. "You should not walk alone that late on the Via Sassari." "I've walked it my whole life. The situation there has changed." He said it simply, without elaboration, in a tone that was— she searched for the right word— careful. It was the tone of a man being careful. Changed how? "There are people in the neighbourhood currently who are unsettled. It's temporary, but for the next few weeks you should take the longer route." Giulia looked at him for a long moment. "Did you know I would see you last night?" Something moved in his expression, a very slight tightening. "No. Are you telling me to change my route because of them, or because of what I saw?" Another pause, this one longer. "Both," he said finally, and the honesty of it surprised her. She had expected deflection. "All right," she said. "I'll take the longer route." He blinked, just slightly, as though he'd expected argument. "You're not going to ask what you saw?" "Would you tell me?" "No." "Then it would be a waste of both our mornings." A silence, then— "Most people," he said slowly, "when they see something they weren't supposed to see, become difficult. They want explanations, they want reassurances, they panic." "I'm not most people," Giulia said. "No," he said. He said it with a weight that had many layers. "You're not." He paid for the bread, he left. But at the threshold he turned, and this time he fully turned, not the half-turn of the previous mornings. And he looked at her with an expression she would spend the rest of the day trying to understand. It was not hunger, though there was something hungry in it. It was not possession, though there was the beginning of something possessive. It was something more complicated, more like a man looking at a thing he cannot have, but cannot stop looking at, and who is only beginning to admit to himself that this is what he's doing. "Giulia," he said. "Yes?" "Be careful." "You say that like you're worried about me." "I am," he said plainly, and left. She stood at the counter and breathed slowly for a moment, her grandmother's voice in her head. "The bread doesn't ask, but the baker decides." She was deciding. She just wasn't sure yet what she was deciding. December arrived with the rain that always announced it in Palermo, heavy and warm for winter, sheeting off the old stones, filling the ornate gutters of the Baroque buildings with rushing, dark water. Giulia's bakery smelled in December of orange peel and cinnamon and something deeper, the slow burn of the stone oven, the particular comfort of a warm room against cold glass. She made bucellati in December, the ring-shaped Sicilian Christmas pastries stuffed with dried figs and almonds and spices. She had been making them since she was 7. She made them the same way every year. On the 1st of December, she made an extra one. She set it on the counter when Enzo arrived, beside his loaf and jam, wrapped in gold paper. He stopped. "It's a bucellato," she said, "for Christmas, or before Christmas. It's been 1st of December in this bakery for as long as I can remember." He looked at the package. He had the expression of a man who has been handed something he does not have an established protocol for. Then he picked it up with both hands, carefully, as though it might break, and he stood holding it. "Thank you," he said. It was, she realized, the first time he had said, "thank you," in 6 weeks of morning visits. "You're welcome," she said. He stood there a moment, still holding the pastry, and there was something in his posture, a slight uncertainty, a quality she had not seen before, that made him seem, very briefly, younger. Not vulnerable, precisely, more like unguarded. "I have a question," he said. "You can ask." "Why are you kind to me?" The question landed in the warm air of the bakery and sat there. Giulia looked at him. "Why wouldn't I be?" she said. "Most people are not. Most people are afraid of you. And you aren't?" She considered this honestly. "I'm cautious," she said. "That's different." He looked at her for a long time. "I don't know how to—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not accustomed to—" Another stop. She watched him, a man who spoke precisely and economically in all things, struggling with something. "This," he said finally. "I'm not accustomed to this." "Bread and jam?" "Being seen." He said it quietly, "as a person, not as the other thing." The bakery was very quiet. The rain on the windows was the only sound. "I can't unsee you," Giulia said simply. "You keep coming back. I don't think you come back for the bread." A pause. Then, to her complete surprise, something happened on his face that was unambiguously a smile. Not large, brief, controlled, like a door opened a crack before being firmly closed again, but entirely real. "The bread is very good," he said. "It is," she agreed. He left. She stood in the bakery, with her hands in the warm air, and she thought, there it is. Whatever it was. There it was. It was a week later that she first heard the name spoken with its full weight. She was at the market, the big outdoor market at the edge of the Palermo, the one that had been there for centuries, buying oranges and almonds for another batch of bucellati, and she overheard 2 men at the adjacent stall speaking in the particular low tone of men discussing serious things. She heard Carbone, and then Cosa Nostra, and then something she caught only partially, about a dispute and a meeting and the northern families. She moved on, bought her almonds, went home, but the words stayed with her. Cosa Nostra, which she had of course heard before, which everyone who grew up in Palermo had heard, which she had understood in the abstract, the way one understands history. You knew it existed, you didn't look at it directly.
That evening she sat in the apartment above the bakery, and she thought for a very long time. She was not naive. She had not, she realized, been naive from the beginning, only choosing a particular frame, the one that was truest to what she experienced in the bakery every morning. A man who said his name. A man who took his change back when she insisted. A man who told her to be careful, with a weight in his voice that was not a threat, but something closer to its opposite. She was not going to pretend she hadn't heard what she'd heard, but she was also not going to pretend that the man she saw every morning was only what the whispers said. Both things were true. She was going to have to live with both things being true. She thought about what her grandmother had said once, about the Bolaro, and about the men who ran certain things in it. Giulia had been 12 and had asked directly, because she was 12 and direct, and her grandmother had been quiet for a long time and then said, "The world is not clean, Piccola. People are not clean. You can choose to only love clean things, or you can choose to love carefully." Giulia had not known what that meant at 12. She was beginning to understand it now. It was Salvatore who told her, not because she asked, she did not ask, but because Salvatore, she was coming to understand, made certain decisions based on a loyalty that was total, and a pragmatism that was, in its way, deeply moral. It was a Sunday. The bakery officially closed, though she was always there by 10, working on the week's preparations. She was in the back room scoring dough when she heard the door. She always left it unlocked on Sunday mornings because there were always people who needed bread and couldn't come on weekdays. And then footsteps that were not the particular tread she had learnt to recognize. She came out and found Salvatore at the counter. He was alone. This was unusual enough that she stopped in the doorway for a moment. "Salvatore," she said. He nodded. He was carrying nothing, was dressed in civilian clothes rather than the dark suit she always saw him in, a fact that somehow made him look both more ordinary and more serious at the same time. "Signora Ferraro," he said, "I want to speak to you." "Sit," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat at the small iron table, a first in her memory, and she made coffee and brought it, and she sat across from him and waited, because he was clearly a man who would say what he meant when he was ready. "Enzo doesn't know I'm here," he said. "All right?" He would not... He picked up the small coffee cup, turned it in his large hands. "He would not approve, probably. But there are things I think you should understand." She kept her face neutral. She was aware that she was being offered something significant, and that how she received it mattered. "His father died 4 years ago," Salvatore said. "Since then, everything, every part of the organization has been his alone. He has no brothers. His sister lives in Rome and has nothing to do with any of it. There are people who work for him, many people, and there are people who work against him. And the difference between those two groups is something he has to calculate every single day." Giulia nodded. "He has not..." Salvatore paused, choosing. "He has not allowed himself to care about anything outside of work in a long time. Not since his father. Not since..." Another pause. "There was a woman, years ago. Before I'm going to tell you anything about that, I should tell you she is not relevant to what's happening now. But she is relevant to understanding why he is the way he is." "The way he is," Giulia repeated quietly. "Careful, controlled. He does not let people get close. It is a security matter and also a personal one. Salvatore drank his coffee. He comes here every morning.
I know.
He comes earlier than he tells me. He tells me 7:15, but he is outside at 6:50 most mornings, sitting in the car, waiting. Giulia felt something shift very quietly in her chest. I tell you this not to— Salvatore set down the cup. I tell you because you are the only person I have seen him look at the way he looks at you, in perhaps 10 years. And you look back, which nobody does, and I think— He stood with the careful deliberateness of a man who has said the most important thing and knows it. I think you should know what you're in. I think you should know that if you ask him to stop coming, he will stop. He would not. He is not a man who— He wouldn't force anything, she said. No, he would not. But if you choose, if you continue— He met her eyes. It will not be a small thing. For him, it won't be a small thing. She was quiet for a long moment. And for the other things? The enemies? Salvatore nodded once. That is the difficulty. Yes. She picked up her coffee cup, drank the last of it. Then she stood and held out her hand to Salvatore. He looked at it for a moment, surprised, she thought, then shook it. Thank you, she said, for coming. He'd kill me if he knew, Salvatore said. But there was something in it that was not quite complaint. I won't say anything. He left. She cleaned the cups and stood at the window and thought about a man in a car outside her bakery at 6:50 in the morning, waiting for something he had probably told himself was just bread. She thought about what she was going to do with this information. She thought about clean things and carefully loved things and the difference between the two. She was still thinking about it when she turned the oven on and began the work of the afternoon. It happened on a Thursday. Giulia was behind the counter when two men walked in, not anyone she recognized, which was itself a signal in a neighborhood where she recognized almost everyone who came through her door. They were young, well-dressed, in a way that was slightly off, the clothes expensive, but the manner underlying them wrong, provincial in some way she couldn't name. They looked around the bakery in a way that was not the way people look at bakeries. We're looking for Carbone, one of them said, not quietly. The three other customers in the shop went very still. Giulia kept her face entirely neutral. This is a bakery, she said. Would you like bread? The man who'd spoken looked at her. He was perhaps 25, with the particular arrogance of someone who had recently come into a small amount of power and had not yet learned that it was small. We know he comes here. Every morning. We're sending a message. I'm a baker, Giulia said. I'm not a message service. The man stepped closer to the counter. The second man had moved slightly to the right, not threatening, not yet, but establishing a position. Giulia did not step back. She had been in this bakery her whole life, and she would not step back from her own counter. You should think carefully, the man said, low, about who you're friends with. I should think carefully, she said, about whether I want to sell you bread. The answer is no. My shop is closed. Please leave. It was, she was aware of this, not a safe thing to say. It was also true, and she was not capable of saying untrue things when she was angry, and she was angry. The man looked at her for a moment that stretched, then, slowly, both of them left.
The bakery exhaled. Dino, from the hardware shop, who was there for his daily roll, said nothing at all. He paid, took his bread, and walked across the street. She watched him through the window. He went into his shop, spoke briefly to Marco, and Marco came out and stood on the corner in a way that would have looked casual to no one who looked twice. She was grateful for this, wordlessly and completely.
That afternoon, closing up, she found Salvatore outside. He stepped out of a shadow, which she thought slightly dramatic, and said, "Tell me what happened." She told him. He listened with complete stillness. "Did they touch anything? Touch you?" "No." He nodded once. He took out his phone, sent a text, put the phone away. "Enzo will know by tonight," he said. "I didn't ask you to tell him." "I know. I'm telling you I'm going to." He held her gaze, something almost apologetic in it. "This is not something I can leave unreported." She understood. "All right. Giulia." He hesitated. This was the first time he had used her first name. "It would be easier, in many ways, if you were not in his life." "I know that." "And it would also be—" He paused again. "He has been different. Since October. I have worked for him for 12 years. I know the difference." She said nothing. "Just—" He stopped, seemed to decide something. "Be patient with him when he comes tomorrow. He will not be... He will want to say things he doesn't know how to say." He left. She went upstairs. She lay awake a long time, listening to the rain on the old stones of Palermo. He came the next morning at 6:53. She was already at the counter when she heard his footstep. She knew it now, that particular tread. And when he came in, he was not wearing his coat, and he had the look of a man who had not slept. He stood at the counter, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was everything he couldn't say. And she looked back at him with an expression she hoped communicated that she was still here, she was fine, and he did not need to perform any kind of crisis. "I heard," he said. "I know. They won't come back. I'm not worried about that. Giulia." He said her name the way he sometimes did, like a beginning that preceded a sentence he then had to find. "You should be concerned about what it means that they came to you, about what it says about your position." "My position in what?" "In relation to me." He said it with difficulty, as though the pronouncement required some fundamental rearrangement. "They came to you because they see you as a connection to me." She looked at him steadily. "Am I?" A long silence. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest thing she had heard from him. "I don't know what you are. I know what I—" He stopped. "Enzo," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat, she made coffee. They sat on opposite sides of the counter in the warm 4 a.m. bakery, and she poured and he drank, and neither of them spoke for a long time. And in that silence was more honesty than most conversations manage in a year. Eventually he said, "I'll have someone outside for the mornings." "You don't have to." "I do." Flat, final. And then, softer, "Let me do this, please." She nodded. He left at 5:30. The sky was just beginning to pale over the rooftops of Palermo, that deep, dark blue going to grey, the first birds beginning.
January was cold by Sicilian standards, not cold by northern standards, but the kind of cold that felt sharper because Palermo was not built for it, was not prepared for it, and met it with a kind of indignant surprise each year, as though the winter were an affront rather than a season.
Giulia wore 2 layers under her apron and kept the oven running higher. Enzo came every morning. There was now, in addition to Salvatore, a second man who appeared outside the bakery on a schedule she could not quite predict. Sometimes there from before she opened, sometimes arriving an hour in. She said nothing about this. She had understood, she thought, the grammar of his concern. He would not crowd her. He would not alarm her. He would simply, quietly, make certain she was safe, and he would not discuss it. She brought the second man coffee on cold mornings. He accepted it with the same expression of slight, bewildered gratitude as Salvatore had with the sesame roll, and she thought, he picks people like himself, careful people, people who are not accustomed to being noticed. In mid-January, Enzo told her about Boston. Not everything, never everything, but pieces. He'd gone at 22, sent by his father to strengthen certain connections, to learn how the American operation worked. He'd spent 2 years there, in a city that was grey and cold and Protestant in its bones, entirely unlike Palermo. "Did you like it?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then, sometimes. There was a bookshop near the university. I used to go there on Sundays." He said this with a slight self-consciousness, as though admitting to an interest in bookshops was more revealing than anything else he might have disclosed. "It smelled like your bakery." She looked at him. A bookshop smelled like my bakery. Old paper, something warm, something that had been a long time in one place. He looked at his coffee. "I hadn't thought about that until just now." She let this sit. "What did you read?" she asked. He was quiet. "History mostly. Italian history. Sicilian history." A pause. "I wanted to understand how we got here." "And do you understand?" "Better than before." He turned the coffee cup. "Not enough." She wanted to ask him, "Do you want out of it?" But she understood, she could feel it in the careful architecture of every conversation they had, that there were questions that would break the particular thing they had built, would ask him to either lie to her or to say something neither of them was ready for. So she didn't ask it. She asked instead, "What books did you like best?" And he looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, but was its neighbour, the recognition again of being offered a side door when he expected a confrontation, and he said, "Lampedusa, the leopard." "Of course," she said softly. "What do you mean, of course?" "It's a book about a man who understands that everything is changing and cannot stop it, and chooses dignity over denial. That seems like your kind of book." He was very still. Then, "Have you read it?" "My grandmother gave it to me at 12. She said, 'This is Sicily. Don't forget.'" He looked at her for a long time. "What was she like, your grandmother?" So Giulia told him. She told him about Rosa Ferraro, who had opened the bakery at 21 with 3,000 lire and a borrowed oven, and a stubbornness that was, Giulia said, probably genetic, who had raised Giulia's mother and then half-raised Giulia, who had known everyone in the Ballaro and been known by everyone and had never, not once in 50 years, turned away anyone who needed bread and couldn't pay.
She told him about the Sunday mornings when Rosa would make the bread and Giulia would stand on a step stool to reach the counter, and Rosa would narrate each step in the slow, deliberate tone of someone transmitting not just technique, but philosophy. When she finished, the bakery was quiet. Enzo had his hands wrapped around his cup, and his eyes were on her with that weight she had learned to recognize. The weight of a man who has been given something and is holding it carefully, afraid to drop it. "She sounds remarkable," he said. She was. She would have... He stopped. "What?" He shook his head once. "Nothing." But she had caught the beginning of it, and she held it in her mind for the rest of the day. She would have... what? Approved? Understood? She would have been the kind of person he would have been honest with. She thought, I am her granddaughter, and maybe that's why. He invited her to dinner at the end of January, not to the bakery, not to a cafe, to his apartment. He said it in exactly the tone he said everything, quiet and without apparent uncertainty, while something in the lines around his eyes betrayed that the asking had cost him. "My apartment," he said. "Friday evening. I'd like to—" A pause. "I'd like to have dinner with you." She considered him for a moment across the counter. Then she said, "Yes." He blinked. She had, she noticed, the ability to surprise him with her directness in a way that seemed genuinely rare. He told her the address. She did not write it down, she would remember it, and he seemed to understand that she would. He said 8 o'clock. She said 8 o'clock. He left. She finished her morning. Elena, her friend, who was not from the neighbourhood but knew it, called that evening, and Giulia told her where she was having dinner Friday, and there was a very long silence on the phone. "Giulia," Elena said, "his apartment is the entire top floor of the Palazzo Agati." "I know." "He bought the whole building 3 years ago." "I know." Are you sure about this?" Giulia thought about Enzo Carbone at 6:50 in the morning, sitting in a car outside her bakery, waiting for something he had probably told himself was just bread. "Yes," she said. Elena was quiet for a moment. "Wear something that's not covered in flour," she said finally. The Palazzo Agati was on the Via Ruggero Settimo, old money Palermo, the broad avenue of the 19th century buildings. The lobby was black marble and brass, and a doorman who moved with the same professional stillness as Salvatore. She gave her name. He took her directly to the elevator. The penthouse had no buzzer. The elevator simply opened into it. She stepped out, and the first thing she experienced was space. The apartment was enormous, not the ostentatious enormousness of a man performing wealth, but the clean, considered enormousness of someone who had simply acquired the largest possible version of private space and then furnished it with the same studied restraint that characterized everything about him. The floors were stone, old, warm-coloured. The walls were bare in large sections, hung in others with what she recognized, even from the elevator, as substantial paintings. The windows were floor to ceiling, and beyond them was Palermo at night, the lights of the city over the old rooftops, the sea beyond, the darkness of the bay. Enzo was in the kitchen, which surprised her somehow. He was in a white shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms, and the contrast of this, the visible human casualness of it, with the rest of the context, was sharp enough to take her breath briefly. "You cook," she said. He looked up. He looked at her. She had worn a dark dress, simple, not flower-covered, and something moved across his face. "Pasta," he said. "Not bread. I know my limitations." She laughed. It was a brief, genuine sound in the large space. He watched it happen on her face, with an expression she had not seen before, wide open, for just a moment, before he composed himself. She walked to the kitchen and leaned on the counter across from him and looked at what he was making. Spaghetti with something that smelled of olive oil and garlic and capers, and something darker, anchovy-based. "Spaghetti alla carrettiera," she said. "My mother's recipe," he said. The Sunday bread wasn't the only thing she made. "Tell me," she said. So he told her. About his mother, briefly, carefully, with the care of someone handling fragile things. A woman from eastern Sicily, Catania. A woman who had known what she was marrying into and had made a private life of warmth inside the larger, harder architecture of the Carbone household. She kept the kitchen as her territory, he said. No business in the kitchen, ever. I don't know how she enforced it. Nobody argued. She sounds like someone who knew exactly how to hold her ground. Yes. He stirred the pasta. Something in his expression softened very slightly, in the way it did when he was thinking about his mother. She would have liked you. Giulia thought, "You've said that almost twice now." She didn't say it. She let it sit. They ate at a long table near the windows, just the two of them, the city below them like an audience at a distance too great to matter. He poured wine, Nero d'Avola, dark and warm. They talked about food, and about Palermo, and about the changes to the neighbourhood, and about Lampedusa's leopard again, because it was apparently a book that lived between them, spacious enough for two people to inhabit. After dinner he poured Amaro, and they stood at the window and looked at the city. "I want to show you something," he said. He crossed to a small side table and returned with a framed photograph. He handed it to her. It was black and white, old, 1960s, a woman at a kitchen table, dark hair, laughing at something outside the frame. "Your mother?" Giulia asked. "My grandmother, the first Enzo Carbone's wife." He looked at the photo with her. She ran the house, the real house, the business house. My great-grandfather was figurehead in many ways. She was the machinery. "She looks joyful." She was, I'm told. She also could terrify a room of men into silence without raising her voice. He took the photo back. "I've been thinking about her lately." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the photograph. Then he looked at Giulia. "Because she is the only person I have ever heard about who could look at the Carbone name without flinching and still find something worth loving in it," he said. "Until recently." The room was very quiet. The city went on below them, indifferent and beautiful. Giulia held his gaze. "I don't love the name," she said quietly. He waited. "I'm interested in the person carrying it." The silence between them had the quality of something about to become something else. He looked at her, that full, flat, searching look, and she looked back. He reached out, and with the back of one finger, with extraordinary gentleness, he touched her cheek. Just briefly, just enough to be true. "Giulia," he said. "Yes," she said, though he hadn't asked anything. February arrived. The routine between them was the same. Her bakery, his morning visits, the bread and the jam and the coffee. But it was different now, in the way that music is different when you have learned the key. He touched her cheek on Friday. On Monday he was at the counter at 7:15, the same coat, the same stillness, and she put down the loaf and the bergamot jam, and he looked at her and said, "How was the weekend?" She smiled. It was a small smile. She was not, by disposition, a large smiler, but it was entirely real. "My friend Eleanor came by Sunday. She wanted to interrogate me about Friday." "What did you tell her?" "That you cook very well." He looked at his bread. Something moved on his face that she had decided by now was the expression he wore when he was trying to suppress a smile and was approximately 50% successful. "And?" he said. "And I had a very good evening." "So did I," he said quietly. There were 2 more dinners in February, always at his apartment, always just the 2 of them, always a quality of careful deliberateness about how he moved toward her, as though he were following some internal discipline about pace, about not taking more than was offered, about the particular respect that serious men sometimes have for serious women, that passes for restraint, but is also a form of attention. He told her about his work, in pieces, never the operational details, never anything she could have repeated, but the shape of it, the weight of it. The way certain decisions were permanent and certain ones were compromises, and the difficulty of knowing in advance which was which. She listened without flinching. She told him about the bakery, the economics of it, which were not easy, the rising cost of flour, the competition from the new industrial bread arriving in the supermarkets, the question of whether the Balaro was changing in ways that would eventually make a small family bakery untenable. She was honest about her worry, which she was not honest about with most people. He listened with the full quality of his attention, which was formidable. "You could expand," he said one evening over the second Amaro. "Into what?" "There's a space 2 streets over, the old spice merchant's premises. The building sold last year." He paused. "I know who owns it now. The space has been empty." She looked at him. "Are you offering to—" "No." Flat, immediate. "I'm not offering anything. I'm noting that the space exists and that you might consider approaching the owners." He held her gaze. "At your own terms." "At my own terms," she repeated. "I would not—" He set down his glass. "I would not be someone who interferes with what is yours, in any direction." She understood what he was saying, what he was promising in the oblique language they had built together. He would not use what was between them to take anything from her or to give her things she had not chosen. He was drawing a line between his world and hers and saying, "I will cross to your side. I will not pull you to mine." "I know," she said. "Do you?" "Yes." She met his eyes. "Enzo, I know." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was warm and large, and she turned hers over and held it, and they sat like that for a long moment in the pale light of his enormous apartment, the city visible beyond the windows. Then he kissed her. It was not like anything she had expected, not that she had expected something specific, but it was quiet and very serious the way he was, not hungry, not urgent, certain. The kiss of a man who has made a decision and made it fully. When it ended, he put his forehead against hers, and he said, very low,
I've been wanting to do that since November. I know, she said again. You knew in November? I knew when you came back the second morning, she said. Most people who are only coming for the bread don't come back the second morning just to check that it's still good. A sound came from him, low, brief, entirely genuine, that was not quite a laugh, but was its first cousin. You, he said, are the most dangerously perceptive person I have ever met. She smiled against his mouth. Good, she said. It was always going to come. She had known this from the beginning, from the first week, probably, from the moment Signora Cataneo had pressed her lips together and said nothing, that whatever was growing between her and Enzo Carbone would not be allowed to grow without interference from the larger world he inhabited. It came in March. It came in the form of a man named Caputo, Rosario Caputo, whose family ran operations out of Catania and who had interests that conflicted, apparently, with the Carbone interests in a particular and pressing way. She didn't know the details. She knew only the effect. Enzo missed 3 mornings in a row. He had never missed a morning. In 5 months, rain or cold or apparent crisis, he had always come. 3 missing mornings was, in the vocabulary they had developed without language, a kind of alarm. On the 3rd morning, she put the bread back under the cloth and stood at the counter and made a decision. She picked up her phone and called the number he had given her, not his public number, which she hadn't been given, but the one he had written on the back of a receipt from a February dinner and slid across the table with no ceremony and a look that dared her to make more of it than it was. He answered on the 2nd ring. Giulia. His voice was different, still level, still controlled, but there was something compressed under it, something held down by force. You haven't come, she said. A pause. I know, there are things happening. Are you all right? Another pause, this one with a different quality, the quality of being asked a question he had not been asked in a long time. Yes, he said, not uncomplicated, but yes. The bread is ready when you are, she said. Something happened on the other end of the line. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it, a slight change in his breathing, a loosening, something that was almost inaudible and entirely real. I'll come tomorrow morning, he said. Good. She hung up and went back to work. He came the next morning, looking like a man who had been awake for most of a week. Not visibly disordered, he was always impeccable, it was one of his disciplines, but there were shadows under his eyes and something in his jaw that spoke of sustained tension. She put the bread on the counter, she put the jam, she put coffee. He sat, not at the counter, but at the small iron table, which he had never done before, and he drank the coffee, and he looked out the window at the Via dei Calderai, and he said nothing for a long time. She worked around him. She restocked the shelves, she wrapped the pastries, she greeted the regulars, who noted Enzo at the iron table with the careful non-reaction of people who have decided that this is now part of the expected landscape of the bakery. Eventually he said, There's a situation with another family out of Catania. She came to the counter and leaned on it. Tell me what you want to tell me. I'm telling you, it may become visible. There may be events in the next few weeks that you hear about in the city. Events, she said, things that happen, that are reported in certain ways. He held her gaze. I want you to hear it from me, that it will be managed. It will not reach you. I'm not worried about myself, she said. I know. He paused.
I'm telling you for other reasons. Because you want me to know what's happening? Yes. He said it simply. I don't want you to read something and wonder and not. I don't want you to be without context. It's... He stopped, looking for words that were apparently difficult.
It matters what you think of me.
In 5 months, she had never heard him say anything so directly exposed. Enzo, she said. He looked at her. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He was very still. Then, you should be more uncertain about that. Probably, she agreed, but I'm not. He stood. He came to the counter and he put both hands on the marble surface and he leaned forward and he kissed her. Not with the careful, deliberate quality of their first kiss, but with something more direct, more honest, less managed. Like a man who has stopped performing composure for a moment. When he pulled back, he was close enough that she could see the tiredness in his eyes clearly. I'll be back tomorrow morning, he said. I'll have the bread ready, she said.
He took her to Nero, his nightclub on the waterfront, the one whose black exterior and silver-lettered sign she had passed 100 times without going inside, on a Wednesday in April. She understood that this was deliberate on his part, to bring her somewhere that was explicitly his, where everyone would see her with him, where the meaning of her presence would be legible to everyone who needed to read it. He did not explain this. He did not need to. She had come to understand how his world communicated, not in words, but in placement, in association, in the careful staging of visibility. It was a message. She was willing to be the message. The inside of Nero was exactly what the name suggested, dark, with a quality of expensive darkness that was its own kind of atmosphere. Low light and deep bass, and the smell of good liquor and something floral she couldn't identify, drifting from arrangements of white orchids at intervals along the walls. The bar was dark marble, backlit, staffed by 4 bartenders moving with choreographic efficiency. The room parted when Enzo walked in, not dramatically, not like a movie moment, but in the particular way of spaces that know who controls them. Conversations shifted direction, eyes moved, positions adjusted. He moved through all of it without appearing to notice, his hand at the small of her back, light, just present, guiding her through the crowd. They were taken to a private section, elevated above the main floor, semi-enclosed by frosted glass panels. There was a low table, a curved leather sofa, a bottle of champagne already open and waiting. She sat beside him and looked out at the room below them. "This is yours," she said. "One of several things that are mine," he said. "This is the most visible. You wanted people to see me here." He looked at her. "Yes." "Why tonight specifically?" "Because the Catania situation has been addressed. Certain questions about my priorities have been raised by various parties. I want the answers to those questions to be visible." He paused. "I want it understood that you are protected," she supplied. "Protected," he agreed. "And—" He stopped. She looked at him. He was looking at the room below, something working in his expression. "Enzo," he turned to her. "Say the whole sentence," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Important. I want it understood that you are important." She felt it, that word in his voice, in that tone, from that face, as something physical. "All right," she said. "Does that disturb you, being visible in this way?"
You're asking if I mind being used as a political statement. I'm asking if I have overstepped. She considered him, this man who controlled so much, and was sitting next to her, asking if he had overstepped. You didn't overstep, she said. You should have asked me. I would have said yes, but you should have asked. Something moved on his face, not shame, more like adjustment. You're right, he said. I should have. Don't do it again without asking. No, he said. I won't. A pause, then, with a gravity, You are extremely difficult to manage. You're not managing me, she said. That's the thing you keep discovering. He looked at her, and that almost smile came, the brief, real one. No, he said, I'm not. They had champagne. He danced with her. She had not expected this, had not thought of him as someone who danced, but he moved with the controlled precision of someone who has learned everything he has learned deliberately, and it turned out that dancing, for Enzo Carbone, was another form of attention. He held her close, not with possessiveness, with something more intentional than that. There's a man at the bar, he said quietly against her hair, who has been watching you since we came in. Is he a problem? No, he's looking at you with an expression I recognize. From mirrors. She laughed, surprised. He tightened his arm around her slightly, and she thought, there it is again. The jealousy, the possessiveness that he holds carefully because he understands it and is afraid of it and will not let it become controlling. Enzo, she said, you don't have to be jealous of a stranger at a bar. I'm not jealous, he said, incorrectly. All right, she said. She felt him smile against her hair. They stayed until midnight. On the drive home, through the lit streets of Palermo, his car with Salvatore in front, he held her hand on the seat between them and looked out the window and said nothing. And it was the most companionable silence she had ever sat inside. It was a warm Thursday in April when she found him standing in the bakery at 2 a.m. Not breaking in, he had a key. She had given it to him 3 weeks prior, in the same matter-of-fact way she did most things, handing it over with, for emergencies, in case I'm stuck in the oven room and can't hear the door. He had looked at the key for a long moment, as though she had handed him an artifact of some significance, and then he had put it in his coat pocket and said nothing. She came downstairs at 2 a.m. for water. She was always slightly dehydrated from the heat of the ovens, and found him sitting at the iron table in the dark, with his coat still on and his hands flat on the table in front of him. She turned on the low lamp above the counter. He looked up. Enzo, she said. I'm sorry, he said. I should have called. Don't apologize. She got water, poured 2 glasses, brought them, sat across from him. His hands were still flat on the table. She noted, without showing that she noted, that they were not entirely steady. She waited. There was something tonight that... He stopped, started again. I made a decision 8 years ago when I came back from Boston about what kind of man I was going to be inside all of this. He was looking at the table. The kind who does not, who contains it, who manages it, who does not bring it... He paused. She understood, without him finishing the sentence, what it was and what home meant. I've never used this key before, he said. I told myself it was for emergencies. It is for emergencies, she said. He looked up at her. This isn't an emergency. What is it? A pause. I needed... He stopped, with the expression of someone who is, for once, not finding the words. "I don't know," he said. "To be here, to be in a room that—" He looked around the bakery, the warm wood, the brass fittings, the flour-dusted surfaces, the ghost of bread and something sweet. "That doesn't know what I do." She was quiet for a moment. "The bakery knows what you do," she said gently. "I know what you do." "I know, but it doesn't—" He paused. "In here, it doesn't feel like what I do is the whole of what I am." She looked at him for a long moment. "It isn't the whole of what you are. Sometimes I'm not sure of that." "I am," she said. He looked at her, that full, searching look, but different now, stripped of the careful composure. She had never seen him like this, still contained, but the containment visible, the effort of it, showing the way effort shows when it has gone on for a long time. She stood and came around the table and sat beside him on the small bench. It was narrow, they were close, and she put her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand and held hers. They sat like that in the warm dark of the bakery for a long time. She did not ask what had happened tonight. She understood that she would not be told, and also that whatever it was, he had come here not to discuss it, but to be somewhere outside it. Eventually, she did not know how much time had passed. He said, "I'm afraid of needing this." She considered the honesty of it, the particular bravery of a man who controls everything, admitting to fear. "What are you afraid happens if you need it?" "That it can be used against me." A pause. "That I can be used against you." "Both of those things may be true," she said. "Is that a reason not to—" "It should be. Enzo." She turned to look at him directly. "People who love things have reasons to protect them. That's not a weakness. That's—" She searched. "That's why you put men outside my bakery in the morning. That's why you told me to take the longer route. You've already decided to need this. You decided months ago. You just haven't admitted it yet." He was very still. She watched him process this, watched the particular quality of stillness that preceded, in him, some internal shift. Then he turned and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before on his face and would not fully have had words for, and it was something like arriving. The expression of a man who has been travelling a long distance and has recognized, suddenly, the landscape. "Yes," he said quietly. She leaned against him, her shoulder against his arm. He put his arm around her and held her with that same extraordinary gentleness, the gentleness that was only possible in someone who understood force very well. They stayed until 4 o'clock, when she had to begin the dough. He watched her work in the early morning dark, and she heard him, at some point, she wasn't sure when, settle into a quiet that was not vigilant and was not composed and was not controlled. It was simply rest. She thought, "This is the thing I am choosing. All of it. Knowing what I know." She shaped the dough. The oven warmed. Outside, Palermo began its long preparation for morning. The man's name was Luca Berti. She knew him slightly. He was from the neighbourhood, had been a few years ahead of her in school, was now, she had gathered from occasional sightings, involved in something or other at the fringes of various local operations. Not Carbone territory, not Catania territory. Something newer, less established, more chaotic in the particular way of people who want power and don't have the discipline to use it carefully. He came into the bakery on a Friday morning in late April, while Enzo was there. This was, she understood immediately, not an accident. He came in with the particular studied casualness of someone who has rehearsed their entrance. And he stood at the counter and he ordered bread. Fine, she sold bread to everyone. And he leaned on the counter in a way that was designed to look relaxed and instead looked like its opposite. And then he said to Giulia, looking at Enzo beside her, Enzo, who had come around the counter that morning to help her move a heavy flour sack and had stayed, "I see you've found yourself a protector." The bakery went absolutely still. Enzo did not move. He had the quality of stillness that she had come to know as his most dangerous quality. The stillness of something that has stopped choosing to be calm and is now simply waiting. "I have a bakery," Giulia said, her voice entirely neutral. "Would you like to pay for your bread? I'm talking to Carbone." "You're at my counter," she said. "You can talk to me." Bertie looked at her. He was trying, she could see, to decide whether to be amused or threatened. He was the type who would find confidence in either. The question was which he found more useful. "You've got nerve," he said, and she heard in it a backhanded admission. "Bread, yes or no?" He paid. He took the bread. At the door he stopped and said, without turning, "This neighbourhood is changing, Carbone. People are watching how you spend your time." He left. The remaining customers, 3 of them, very carefully returned to being absorbed in other things. Enzo had not moved or spoken during this entire exchange. Now he turned to look at her. His expression was complex. Something that was partly controlled anger, partly something she identified after a moment as concern. "You should have let me handle that," he said. His voice was very quiet. "He was at my counter," she said. "I handled it." "Giulia, I'm not your—" She paused, finding the right word. "I am not an adjunct to your power. He came in here to make a point to you. I'm not going to be made a point of without responding." "I understand that. That's not—" He paused, took a breath. "You're correct. You're also someone He stopped again. "Someone you care about," she supplied. "Yes. And your instinct, when something threatens someone you care about, is to handle it. Control it," she corrected. He was quiet. Then, with an effort that was visible, "Yes, control it. That's not how this works." "I know. Do you?" He looked at her for a long time. "I am trying," he said, and it was the most unadorned thing he had ever said. No calculation in it, no management, just true. She softened. She could not help it, with that particular honesty. "I know," she said. She reached across the counter and briefly touched his hand, one of their small, non-public gestures, invisible to the remaining customers if they weren't looking for it. "Bertie is a problem?" she asked, low. "A minor one. He's ambitious without the ability to back it up. He will be dealt with." "By dealt with, you mean—" "Moved off. There are ways to make it clear to someone that a particular territory is not available to them, that don't require—" He paused. "Finality." "Finality," she repeated. She let the words sit. "All right." "I want to move you," he said. She blinked. "What?" Not permanently, for a few weeks, while this is being managed. He held her gaze. There are rooms at my apartment. You could bring what you need. The bakery would still run. I'll have someone come in for the morning. I'm not leaving my bakery, she said. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. Of course not. I knew you'd say that. Then why did you suggest it? Because I feel the need to suggest it every time something like this happens, and you tell me no, and I accept it. He looked at her with an expression that was, she recognized it now, his version of helplessness, total competence in everything and nothing that worked here. It is extremely difficult to be responsible for someone who refuses to be managed. I'm not yours to be responsible for, she said. You are, he said quietly, whether you'll allow me to act on it or not. She looked at him for a long moment. Then protect me the way I'll let you, and trust me to protect myself with the rest. He was quiet. Then, the longer route, he said, always. The longer route, she agreed. They looked at each other across the marble counter, in the warm smell of bread, with the whole complicated architecture of their situation between them. And both of them, in that moment, understood that the architecture was exactly as complicated as it was going to be, and that they had both decided, somewhere along the way, to build inside it anyway. She met his sister in May. Carlotta Carbone lived in Rome and visited Palermo twice a year, once in spring, once before Christmas. And her arrivals were apparently events of some significance in the household. Giulia learned this from Salvatore, who told her with the careful neutrality of a man conveying information he thought she should have. She is direct, he said. Is she kind? She is honest, he said, which was not quite an answer. The meeting happened at the family villa, the Carbone estate on the Monreale hills above the city, which Giulia had not previously visited. Enzo drove her there on a Sunday afternoon, through the climbing streets of the old hills, the city spreading out below them like a painting. The villa was old, genuinely old, not performed old, with that settled, weathered quality of buildings that have stood through too much history to pretend. The gardens were immaculate. Lemon trees, jasmine, a long gravel walk bordered by lavender. Inside, it smelled like old wood and something floral and, faintly, bread. She registered this with a private warmth. Carlotta was waiting in the front sala. She was 43, dark like her brother, with Enzo's same quality of controlled attention. But where Enzo's control felt like armor, Carlotta's felt like efficiency. The directness of a woman who has decided not to waste time on performance. She looked at Giulia with the full, assessing look of someone who was not going to be polite at the expense of accurate. So, she said, you're the baker. I am, Giulia said. He talks about you. That's unusual. He usually talks about nothing. Carlotta, Enzo said, I'm being honest. She didn't look at her brother. She was still looking at Giulia. What do you make of all this? Genuinely. Not what you think I want to hear. Giulia considered her. She liked her immediately. The way she'd liked Salvatore's particular honesty, the way she'd liked the Hardware brothers' silent protectiveness. The people around Enzo who were genuinely loyal were genuinely good people. This seemed significant. I make of it, Giulia said carefully, that your brother is one of the most careful people I have ever met, and that the things that make him difficult have the same source as the things that make him worth knowing. Carlotta looked at her for a moment.
Then she looked at Enzo, then back at Giulia.
She said, which appeared to be her equivalent of approval. They had lunch in the dining room, a long room with paintings of varying centuries and a table that seated 20 and 3 people at one end of it. The cook, an ancient woman named Assunta, produced a succession of dishes that were entirely Sicilian and entirely magnificent. Carlotta talked about Rome, about her work. She was an architect, which Giulia hadn't known and found exactly right. She talked about the city and about buildings and about what it meant to design something meant to last. She talked, obliquely, about the family, things she had made a separate peace with, things she had not. She talked with the ease of a woman in her own space, at her own table. Enzo was quieter than usual, as though his sister's presence gave him license to simply be in a room rather than managing it. He ate. He occasionally added something to the conversation. He watched Giulia and Carlotta talk, with the expression of a man who is experiencing something unexpected and choosing to be grateful rather than alarmed. After lunch, Carlotta took Giulia to the garden. "He was not always this careful," she said, when they had walked far enough from the house. "What happened?" "You know the general shape of it. Father, the succession." She paused, deadheading a rose with the mechanical ease of someone who has done it all her life. "And before that, there was a woman. In Boston. It ended badly. She was—" Carlotta chose the word precisely. "Deliberate in her approach to him. There was a family connection she was trying to secure through him. He didn't understand this until afterward." "He was used," Giulia said. "Yes." Carlotta dropped the dead bloom. "He learned, I think you decided, that certain things were too expensive. He decided the cost of allowing himself to—" She paused. "You understand what I'm saying. The cost of caring about something is that it can be threatened," Giulia said. "Yes. He understood that very well before Boston. Boston made it doctrine." She looked at Giulia. "You are the first person since then who has breached, as it were." "I didn't breach anything. He came to my bakery." "He came back to your bakery every morning for months before anything happened." Carlotta looked at her with that direct architect's gaze. "Do you know how unusual that is? Enzo Carbone is not a man who does things without purpose. He came back because something in him needed to, despite himself." Giulia said nothing. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what you have," Carlotta said, "not as a warning, as information." She resumed walking. "He will be difficult. He will try to control things. He will be terrified in ways he won't name and protective in ways that will occasionally frustrate you. He has spent 30 years learning how to manage everything." A pause. "He can't manage you. I think that's why he keeps coming back." Giulia thought about this. "Is that a good thing?" "I think for him it might be the best possible thing." Carlotta glanced sideways at her. "Don't tell him I said that. He'll deny it and then spend 3 weeks being aggressively self-sufficient." Giulia laughed. It came out more fully than she expected, the laugh of someone who recognizes something exactly true. Carlotta looked at her with something warm in her expression. "Good," she said. "He needs someone who can laugh." They walked back through the lavender, the city glittering far below, the afternoon light going golden over the old stones of the villa. It came in June, as these things do, without sufficient warning, with the particular timing of crises. On an ordinary morning, when she had flour on her hands and 3 loaves in the oven. Salvatore came in at 6 a.m., before even her earliest regulars, and he had the look of a man who had been up all night and who was delivering news he would have preferred not to deliver.
"There's been an incident," he said.
She set down the lame. "Is he alive?" "Yes," immediately. "Yes, he's uninjured. But there's been a situation in the city. It will be in the news today. He wanted you to hear it from me before you read it." A pause. "He cannot come this morning." "What happened?" Salvatore looked at the counter. There were consequences to the Caputo situation, things that reached further than anticipated. There are people who have been... He stopped. There are things that were done last night that he will be connected to, in the press, in a particular way. Was he there? No. But he authorized it. A long silence, then, yes. She was quiet for a moment. She took the loaves out of the oven. They needed to come out or they would burn, and she set them on the rack, and she stood with her back to Salvatore for a long moment. "Is anyone innocent hurt?" she asked. "No," he said, with an emphasis that told her he had prepared for this question. The people involved they were not innocent people. She turned around. Salvatore was watching her with the expression of someone braced for a reaction he can't fully predict. She said, "Tell him the bread will be here tomorrow morning." Salvatore blinked. "That's all?" "That's all." He left. She finished her morning, served her customers, kept her voice even and her hands steady. She read the news on her phone at 11 when the bakery was quiet. A brief report, careful language, the names of people she didn't know, the suggestion of organized crime connections without the naming of names. It was, she understood now, reading between the careful journalistic language, the outcome of a war she had been watching through glass for months. She was not naive about what it meant. She was also not naive about the man who had sat in her bakery at 2 in the morning, holding her hand while Palermo slept. Both things were true. She was living inside the truth of both things. Enzo came the next morning. He looked as though the night had been long, not dishevelled, never dishevelled, but with that quality of compressed tension she now recognized as his version of distress. He stood at the counter. He did not speak immediately. She put the bread and the bergamot jam in front of him. "Giulia," he said. "Yes?" "You read the news?" "Yes." "And you—" He stopped. "I'm here," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was, she could only describe it as exhausted openness. A man with nothing left to manage with. "I don't know," he said, "how to do this. Be this, and also be what I am. I don't know if it's possible. I've spent 10 years believing it wasn't possible." "Maybe it isn't," she said honestly. "Maybe something has to change." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to change what you are," she said. "I'm asking whether there's a version of your life that," she searched, "that has this in it, that has mornings, that has bread and coffee and—" She stopped. "I'm not an ultimatum. I'm a question." A long silence. "I've been thinking about it," he said, "for months. There are aspects of what I do that are essential. And there are aspects that are inherited, accumulated. Things I took on because they were there, not because I chose them." He paused. "It would take time. And it would not be clean. And there would be people who it would complicate certain things significantly. "I know," she said, "but I'm—" He stopped, put both hands flat on the marble. "I'm willing to try to find it. That version." She looked at him for a long moment, at the worn marble of the counter, at the light coming in through the bakery windows, the particular morning light of June in Palermo, golden and absolute. "Then find it," she said. He looked at her with that arriving expression, the landscape recognized. "The bread is good," he said. "It is," she agreed. He paid. He picked up the bread and the jam.
He did not pause at the threshold. He turned and looked at her fully. "Thank you," he said, and this time it landed differently than it had in December, larger, with more weight, carrying more than what it said. "You're welcome," she said. "Same time tomorrow?" He left. She stood in the warm bakery and breathed the smell of bread and morning, and outside the Bolaro went on being itself, complicated and old and alive, and for the first time in a long time she felt entirely clear. Summer in Palermo was different from any other season. It arrived decisively, the way Sicilian seasons always did, without apology or transition. One day it was spring, and the next the light was white, and the stones held heat long after dark. In the bakery, this meant earlier mornings and a modified schedule. The ovens off by 9 when the heat became prohibitive, the morning's work done by 8. She adapted, as she always had, because adaptation was the essential skill of bakers, and, she had concluded, of everyone. In July, Enzo began to make changes. She didn't ask for specifics, that was not her territory, but she could see the shape of it in the way he moved through his days, in what he talked about and what he didn't, in a new quality of deliberateness in his expression when they were together. He was building something different, she understood, not abandoning what he was, but renegotiating its boundaries, extracting himself from certain things, transferring control of others. It was slow and it was complicated, and he said very little about it, except once, in August, when they were on the terrace of the penthouse at midnight, with the city quiet below them. "It's like—" he paused, looking for the analogy. "It's like changing the foundation of a building while the building is still standing. The structure can't collapse, but the foundation has to change." "Your sister would have a professional opinion about that," Giulia said. "I called her about it. She said it was theoretically possible with the right engineering and a willingness to work slowly." "Sounds about right." He looked at her sideways, and the almost smile came. More often now, and staying slightly longer. "You're very calm about all of this." "Bread has to rise at its own pace," she said. "You can't rush the fermentation." He laughed, actually laughed, quiet and brief, but entirely real. She was collecting them now, these laughs, the way one collects particularly good mornings. In August, she took on the space on Via Crispi. She did not accept anything from Enzo. This was important to her, and he understood it and did not press. But she used the 12,000 euros her grandmother had left, and a small bank loan, and the particular stubbornness that was apparently genetic, and she signed the lease on the second space. Not a second bakery. She didn't want a chain. She didn't want management of other bakers. She didn't want the loss of handmade in any direction. What she wanted was a small school. Bread making. Saturday mornings. 6 students at a time. The curriculum was entirely her grandmother's.
The same narrated method, the same philosophy of patience and attention, the same emphasis on what the dough tells you if you pay attention. She taught the first class in September. Enzo came. She had not asked him, had not specifically invited him, but she had mentioned, without making it an invitation, that she was teaching her first class Saturday morning, and at 7 a.m. he was at the counter. He did not join the class. He sat at the iron table with his coffee and watched. She did not acknowledge him particularly. She was working. She had 6 students who needed her attention, but she was aware of him there, in the warm morning light, watching her teach the thing her grandmother had taught her. After the students left, she began cleaning up. He came to the counter and stood across from her. "You teach the way she taught you," he said. "Probably." She wiped down the marble. "It's the only way I know. You narrate each step. You have to understand what you're doing and why. You can't just follow motions." "No," he said. He was looking at the counter, at the flour-dusted surface. "You can't." She looked up. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention. That quality she had come to understand was rare, and was not ordinary attention, but something more concentrated, more deliberate. The attention of a man who has decided that the thing in front of him is worth full presence. "I love you," he said. It landed in the flower-scented air of the bakery with a simplicity that was, somehow, exactly right. Not dramatic, not performed, just said. The way he said his own name that first morning, matter of fact, certain, a thing being put on the counter like change. She set down the cloth. She looked at him across the marble. "I know," she said. A pause. "And," he said, and there was, for the first time, something genuinely uncertain in his voice, unguarded, open. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting for you to be ready to hear it." He was very still for a long moment. Then he came around the counter, unhurried as always, and he put his hands on her face, gentle and certain, and he kissed her with the seriousness and the attention and the particular weight of a man who has come a very long way to arrive here. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "The longer route," he said quietly. She laughed, full, real, unheld. "Yes," she said, "the longer route." He stayed until noon. They ate bread and cheese at the iron table in the morning light, talking about nothing particular, the students, the September heat, whether the bakery needed new shelving before the autumn, while outside the Bolero went on in its ancient, complicated, beautiful way. A year after the first morning, she noticed the anniversary because she remembered everything. It was a quality she'd inherited from her grandmother, along with the recipe for the buccellato, and because the particular quality of October light over Palermo, bright and slightly mournful, had lodged itself in her memory as the light that had been falling through the bakery windows the morning a tall man in a dark coat had come through the door and stood, cataloguing exits. She made the same loaf, the plain, large one, the one from the centre rack where the heat was most even. She made it with the particular care of something being made as both gift and ceremony. He arrived at 7:15. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the same as that first morning, that pause. But this time, when he looked at the room, he was not cataloguing exits. He was looking at her. She put the loaf on the counter. She put the bergamot jam. She added, because it was October, and because a year had passed, and because she could, a small jar of the blood orange marmalade her neighbour made, the one she had offered that 6th morning, the morning that had changed the shape of everything. He came to the counter. He looked at the 3 items. "Blood orange," he said.
My neighbour's. You never actually tried it.
I got distracted.
By what?
He looked at her. By you saying my name back to me. She held his gaze. Enzo. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," she said. "It's the anniversary." He raised an eyebrow. "A year ago today," she said. "You came in and said pane, and I said which kind, and you gave me too much money, and I gave you back the change." He was still for a moment. Then, "I sat in the car outside for 20 minutes before I came in that morning." She blinked. 20 minutes. Not, Salvatore told me you came early, but he didn't say 23, he said, with the precision of someone who was there. "I drove past twice."
I had no intention of... He stopped, with the expression of a man caught in the middle of a confession he had apparently decided to make. "I saw the light on inside, through the window, 4:30 in the morning, this room with the light on, and through the window I could see..." He paused. "Someone working. Just working, like it was the most ordinary thing." She was very still. "I parked," he said. "I told myself I was getting bread. I sat for 23 minutes and told myself I was getting bread." "Were you?" she asked, softly. He looked at her. "No," he said. I don't know what I was doing. I saw something ordinary and I needed to be near it, even that early, even as a stranger." He paused. "I should have told you that months ago." "You're telling me now?"
"Yes." He put his hands on the counter, flat, the way he always did when he was being fully honest. I have always struggled to..." "I know," she said. "To let myself need things," he finished. "I know," she said again. He looked at her. "You always know." "I pay attention," she said. He shook his head slightly, not frustration, more like wonder. He picked up the loaf and the jam and the blood orange marmalade, and he held them in one arm, and with his other hand he reached across the counter, and he took hers, and he held it for a moment. "Same time tomorrow," he said. "I'll have the bread ready," she said. He walked to the door. He paused. She was waiting for it, had been waiting for it from the first morning, had recognized it even then as his particular habit, the threshold pause. He turned. "Would you like some jam today?" he said. She looked at him. He was almost smiling, that brief, real, contained smile that she had been collecting all year. "I have plenty," she said. "You bring some tomorrow." He laughed. He left. Salvatore, outside, gave her the small nod, which had evolved over the year into something warmer, something that on a different face might have been a smile. She stood at the counter and breathed. The bakery smelled of bread and morning. Outside, the Bolaro was waking, scooters, vendors, old men arranging their plastic chairs, the whole ancient, complicated machinery of a neighbourhood that had been here for centuries and would be here for centuries more, indifferent and resilient and, in its way, beautiful. She tied her apron tighter. She began the work of the day. Winter came again, as it always did. The bucciolati appeared on the 1st of December, gold-wrapped, on the counter beside the plain loaves. She made one extra. She had made one extra every December since the first year, and it was always waiting when he arrived, and he always picked it up with both hands with the same careful expression. The one she had decided by now was the expression he reserved for things he had not expected to have and did not want to hold incorrectly. Christmas was at the villa on the hill. It was the first time, not the first time at the villa, she had been there often by now, had come to know Assunta and the garden and the particular weight of the place's history, but the first time for Christmas. Carlotta was there. Several family members she had met gradually over the previous months. A cousin from Messina who was warm and talkative, an uncle from Rome who was quieter and watched her with the particular assessing look of a man evaluating an addition to the architecture of something he cared about. She brought bread. Not as a gesture of domesticity or submission, she brought bread the way she brought herself anywhere, as the thing she was. She brought the large plain loaf and the blood-orange marmalade and a batch of bucciolati enough for everyone, and she set them on the enormous old dining table beside Assunta's dishes, and old Assunta looked at the bread with an expression of such genuine respect that Giulia felt, privately and completely, that she had been accepted. After dinner, after Carlotta had taken the cousin to the other room for coffee and argument, and the uncle had excused himself with the quiet efficiency of a man who knows when to leave, Giulia stood at the tall windows of the dining room, looking at the city below. Palermo at night, December. The lights scattered across the dark, like something scattered from a handful. Enzo stood beside her. He was in a dark sweater rather than his coat. He wore it in winter sometimes, at the villa, where the ancient heating system was more suggestive than definitive, and he had a glass of the Amaro he always favoured, and he was looking at the city with the expression she had come to know as his contemplative one, not closed, not composed, just present with a thought. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The view," he said. "It hasn't changed much from this window in 40 years. My grandfather said the same thing when he looked at it. Is that good or bad? It's—" he paused. "It's reassuring, I think, that some things persist." She looked at the city. All those lights, all those rooms, all those people, the whole improbable persistence of Palermo, which had been burned and occupied and occupied again and rebuilt again and gone on, stubbornly, in the particular style of places that are too old to be defeated by anything as temporary as disaster. "She would have liked this," Giulia said. My grandmother." He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me why." "She liked things that were honest about what they were. This," she gestured at the view, at the room, at all of it, "is honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him. They stood, looking at Palermo, their city, their complicated, ancient, impossible city, and the darkness was full of lights, and the lights were full of lives, and all of it went on in its ancient way. "I have been working on something," he said. "For the past months. I didn't want to say anything until it was more certain." "Tell me now." "Some of the construction interests, the legitimate ones, I've been formalizing them separately, building a structure that is entirely above. There's a project in the north of the city, a residential development that I've been approached about." "It would be—" he paused. It would be the kind of thing I could do without, the other kind of involvement. She was quiet, understanding the weight of what he was telling her. Not everything changes at once, he said, not immediately. But the direction. He tightened his arm around her slightly. The direction is changing. The foundation, she said. Yes. She thought about his sister's borrowed metaphor, changing the foundation while the building stands, about the patience it required, about the particular bravery of a man who had built his entire identity on control, choosing, slowly, carefully, with full awareness of the cost, to change the substrate of the thing. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The first morning, when you came in and said, 'pain,' just the one word, what did you expect?" He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking, really thinking, not managing toward an answer. "Nothing," he said finally. "I expected nothing. I had not thought beyond the bread, the light, being in a room that was warm." He paused. "I think I expected to feel better briefly, and then leave and not come back. And then I asked which kind. And then you asked which kind." She heard something that was almost a smile in his voice. "And you looked at me like I was just a person. You are just a person. You are the only one who has ever been entirely sure of that." She turned her head and looked at him, his profile against the window and the city, this serious, careful, complicated man who had sat in a car for 23 minutes before coming in for bread. "I'm always sure of it," she said. He turned and looked at her, that full, flat look, but lit now in a way that it hadn't been that first October morning. Lit the way a room is lit when someone opens the door and lets in the morning. He kissed her, simply, briefly, the way he did sometimes, that was not hungry and was not urgent and was simply the ongoing fact of them, true and present and here. When he pulled back, he said, "Same time tomorrow." "Same time tomorrow," she said. "I'll have the bread ready." "And the jam?" "Blood orange." "Good," he said. They went back to the table, where Carlotta was making extravagant claims about football, and the cousin was arguing cheerfully, and the uncle was pouring more Amaro, and old Assumpta was bringing out the last of the bucciolati, and the villa was warm and loud and old in the way of places that have held many winters and expect to hold many more. In the mornings it was always the same. 4:45. The door. The warm, dark interior. The beginning. She made the dough, as she always had, naturally leavened, 22 hours, the patience her grandmother had taught her. And she shaped it with the practiced ease of muscle memory, and she loaded the stone oven, and she waited for the heat. The first loaves out by 6:30, the regulars beginning at 7, Signora Cataneo for her rosemary focaccia, the Hardware brothers for their sesame rolls, the young mother and her picky daughter, and the soft milk bread, all the ordinary, faithful business of a neighbourhood bakery, all the small, repeated rituals of daily bread. And at 7:15, the door, the particular quality of silence that preceded it. And then him, tall, dark coat, unhurried in the way of men who do not need to rush, and the counter, and the wrapped loaf, and the jam already waiting, and she behind the counter with flour on her hands, and the question she had asked every morning since that 6th October day, the question that had started everything, The question she asked, not because she needed the answer, but because asking was itself the answer. "Would you like some jam today?" And every morning he looked at her across the marble counter with that expression she had spent a year learning, the arriving expression, the landscape recognized, and he said, yes. He always said, yes. Outside the bakery, the Via dei Calderai went on being itself. The scooters and the vendors and the old men in their plastic chairs, the ornate gutters of the Baroque buildings carrying whatever the sky sent down. The particular light of Palermo, different in every season, always beautiful, always slightly heartbreaking, the way that beauty is always slightly heartbreaking when you know enough to understand that it is rare. The sign above the door read Il Forno di Rosa in fading gold. It had been offered to be repainted more than once. She had declined more than once. Some things were not supposed to look new. Some things were exactly right as they were. The bread rose. The oven was warm. The morning came. This is how it was. This is how it is. Same time tomorrow. The Baker and Sicilian Mornings is a work of fiction. All characters, families, and organizations depicted are entirely invented. The bakeries of Palermo, however, are entirely real, and the bread is exactly as good as described. In the end, what we are is not the sum of what we have done, but the sum of what we have chosen to return to.